Thank you very much, Kumba. So I start by apologizing that I'm the only one that's using this. Um, I mean, here for the panel. So where Abdullah has said half of his brain, the French side, was not working, it means it's only me who has come with half a brain on the panel. So I think you will forgive me that. But thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here. And because part of my incarnation, in fact, just maybe to explain, as I had been introduced and Ebrima had acknowledged some of the things that I'm doing, and he had said, among other things, I'm professor at Sciences Po, but just to explain that I teach in English when I'm there. So it's just that half brain that's working over there. But I want to acknowledge one of my bosses, Said Gasama, who is sitting here, who is the director of Amnesty International here. These are the owners of Amnesty International, the 8 million people across the world that we serve in the International Secretariat. So, you started by asking the question, what kind of integration are we talking about? That's the critical question. What kind of integration are we talking about? And I will give you a quick example of the kind of integration that I am not thinking about, that I'm not talking about. Several years ago, when I was working as executive director of Open Society Initiative for Southern Africa, based in Johannesburg, one of my responsibilities was to travel to Mozambique regularly. As a Zimbabwean, holding a Zimbabwean passport, whenever I arrived in Mozambique, I would be given a visa for a single entry. And I would come back after a week and get another visa for a single entry. And I would come back after 3 days and get another visa for a single entry. Notwithstanding the fact that it so happens that between my two parents, one of them is descended from people from Mozambique. And notwithstanding the fact that as a Zimbabwean, it's very difficult to get a passport because of all the things that are happening in my country. On the other hand, I also used to travel regularly into Zambia. I used to see many women that were raising chickens on their plots, on their little plots in front of their houses or at the back of their houses. And they would sell these chickens to the big supermarkets. Suddenly, there was an opening whereby ShopRite and other big supermarkets were now not buying those chickens from those women anymore. They were not buying those chickens from those women anymore, but were now buying those chickens from big commercial farmers in South Africa, flying them to Zambia, and then substituting what those women had been trying to do, is to facilitate the movement of African people. But if the agreement is going to be respected in relation to the movement of capital, but not the movement of African people, it will not be the kind of integration that I would like to see. In the Niamey Declaration in Niger in July, when the African Union acknowledged the beginning of the Continental Free Trade Agreement, one of the things they talked about there was the importance of the movement of people. So I'm hoping that this is going to continue to be an issue so that Africans are able to visit one another in our different countries, as well as our goods are going to be able to move across our borders. If we end up with movement of our goods but not movement of our people, it is not the kind of integration that I hope we would support. Secondly, is the question that he also spoke about, of how we support the efforts of small people, if you will, that are trying to do something. It is good that the protocol on trade in goods seeks to support infant industries. And it says infant industries could be infant industries by women, by youth, and so on. It's going to be very important that efforts be put into making this real so that the small and medium enterprises that are formed, for instance, by women and by young people are able to compete within the context of the free trade agreement. Another dimension that I think is important to raise from where I sit is the question of the human rights impact of the free trade agreement. Many trade agreements these days recognize that trade has an impact on human rights. You can have a situation, for instance, where you are trading, but you are trading also in guns and ammunition that is going to be used to actually start a war. Colombia and Canada, for instance, have made sure that in their agreement on trade, they have included a clause that looks at the human rights impact of the trade between the two countries. We do not have that within our Continental Free Trade Agreement. It is important that those of us who are here, as part of the public conscience of Africa, advocate for the inclusion of human rights assessments of how the Continental Trade Agreement is being implemented. Relatedly, and 2 points before I conclude, is the question of the regional economic communities and their contribution to the free trade agreement. So the regional economic communities are of course recognized within the Continental Free Trade Agreement, from the Maghreb Union, through COMESA, through the Saharan Community, ECOWAS, IGAD, SADC, and so on. This is important, and they are seen under Article 19 of the agreement as part of the building blocks for implementing the agreement. But the problem is, we also know, for instance, that in the context of SADC, the tribunal of SADC was denounced by our member states. So the tribunal, the SADC tribunal, the court that should arbitrate disputes within SADC is presently not functioning because the member states said we don't want it. It is saying too much. That is actually going into interests that we would rather protect. So if we are going to have effective regional economic communities that are contributing to the emergence of free trade, it's going to be important that the rule of law be respected. And part of the rule of law being respected is the role of institutions such as the SADC tribunal. Just as the ECOWAS court, for instance, has actually produced many judgments that have been seen as useful at the ECOWAS level. In the context of the World Trade Organization, there is an important provision, Article 20 of the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, which forms the basis of the WTO agreement. Makes sure that states have the possibility of protecting, even in the context of world trade, of protecting situations where human life is threatened, where extractive industries may be threatened, as Abdullah was saying. So if free trade might end up meaning that you are extracting everything in a country, from our cocoa to our minerals to our fertilizers to everything, coal train and so on and so forth. The World Trade Organization has recognized that a country has a right to say, no, we are opting out of this particular agreement if it is to the detriment of our people in terms of extractive industries. We do not have the equivalent of that within the free trade agreement. However, we have things such as the Africa Mining Vision that has also said it is important to protect our minerals for the purposes of the people of the continent. One of the things that I would like to see in relation to the point that Abdullah raised about extractive industries would be some level of sensitivity and protection of the exhaustible natural resources, the minerals, the trees, the soils, and everything that we have, which cannot be renewed, which are sometimes the only thing that Africans have that they are hanging on to. And within the context of free trade, these things must continue to be protected. And very finally, within that context then, I think it's also important to ensure, as we look at the implementation of the free trade agreement, the question of ensuring that the laws of our countries, and this goes to your point about ratification, which was your last point, the laws of our countries are aligned to be able to support the vision of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. And that alignment ranges from ensuring that our administrative laws are efficient, are appropriate, are not hijacked by a few people in the ruling party or by militaries and so on. It ranges from that right through to how our laws also enable us to domesticate international agreements. So we have examples, for instance, where Namibia, in its constitution, in Article 144 of its constitution, has ensured that when Namibia signs on to an international agreement, that international agreement becomes automatically a part of Namibian law. We have a number of countries that do not have a similar provision. It is important that we think of provisions like that in our laws, in our constitutions, that enable the African Free Trade Continental Agreement to automatically become part of our law, but also to be accompanied by the kind of thing that Abdullah was talking about, which is domestic discussion of the importance of continental free trade. So I look forward to an opportunity to discuss these and other issues that Abdullah raised, and I thank you for the opportunity to chat with you tonight about these issues. Thank you.